The wind howled through the gorse and heather as Agatha Rowley stood at the edge of the cliffs, her long wool coat flapping about her legs like a tattered flag. Below her, the sea churned in greys and greens, relentless and hungry. The sky above was the color of old tin, flat and brooding, promising another storm by nightfall. It was always like this in Whitley Edge. 12 years had passed since the night Thomas Rowley disappeared from the old lighthouse. 12 long years since the great storm that had swallowed his ship whole, and with it, the man Agatha once loved. Not a body was ever found. Only the shattered wreck of his lifeboat had washed ashore, splintered and silent. Locals whispered that she was cursed. That she'd cursed him. Some claimed they still saw her climbing the narrow path to the cliffs at dawn, lantern in hand, calling his name. She never corrected them. Let them believe what they wished. Truth was stranger, and lonelier. Her days were quiet now, clocked only by the rhythm of the tide and the occasional letter from her sister in Alnwick, never replied to. She spoke to no one but the gulls and the sea. Until the morning the stranger arrived. He came walking along the footpath from the village, wearing a coat too fine for the weather, with a bag slung over his shoulder and a book tucked under his arm. Young, perhaps in his early 30s. Clean-shaven, with clever eyes that missed nothing. He stopped at the gate of her garden, hesitating. "Mrs. Rowley?" he asked, voice soft but sure. She didn't answer. Only stared. "I'm Daniel Mercer. I've taken the rental cottage, Coastwatcher's Rest. Mrs. Haddon said I should let you know, as you're the nearest neighbor." Agatha gave the smallest of nods. That cottage had been empty for nearly 5 years. He looked harmless enough. But then, so had the sea that night. "I'm a historian," he added, filling the silence. "I'm researching maritime disappearances. I understand your husband died," she said, cutting him off. Daniel hesitated. "Yes. I'm sorry." He waited for a moment longer, then offered a polite smile and walked away down the overgrown path to the cottage. Agatha didn't move. Only watched until he was gone from sight. That evening, a mist rolled in from the sea, thick and silvery. The lighthouse, long decommissioned, loomed like a sleeping ghost at the headland. As night fell, a faint flicker of light appeared in one of its windows. Just a single blink. Then gone. Agatha turned away from the window. She'd seen it too. But she said nothing. Rain lashed the windows of Coastwatcher's Rest as Daniel Mercer unpacked his belongings. The cottage was smaller than he expected, 2 rooms, both low-ceilinged with walls that smelled faintly of salt and age. But it had charm, and more importantly, proximity to the old lighthouse and the Rowley house. He lit a fire in the hearth and set out his notebooks, maps, and one leather-bound journal already filled with scribbled questions. His research focused on disappearances along the Northumberland coast, and the Rowley case had always stood out, officially closed, but shadowed by unanswered questions. There had been whispers in old press clippings. Rumors of arguments between Thomas Rowley and another keeper. Suggestions of someone tampering with the lighthouse's light that night. Even mentions of a woman seen walking the cliffs after midnight. Daniel made a note, ask Agatha Rowley about last watch logbook. But he wasn't sure she'd ever let him close enough to ask. The next morning, the rain cleared. Daniel wandered the coastline, camera in hand, collecting shots of the jagged rocks and rusted remains of shipwrecks. He paused near the base of the lighthouse, now sealed shut with rusting chains. The door creaked. Startled, Daniel turned. No one. But he noticed fresh footprints in the damp earth, small, booted, not his. Someone had been here. Recently. Back at the cottage, he knelt to poke at a loose floorboard in the bedroom. It had squeaked strangely when he'd first stepped on it. Curiosity tugged at him, and with some effort, he pried it up. Beneath the plank, wrapped in oilskin and tied with twine, was a thin, cloth-bound book. A journal. He brought it to the table and carefully unwrapped the bundle. Inside, the pages were filled with neat handwriting. Not Thomas Rowley's, but Agatha's. The first line made him freeze. The sea never truly takes what it claims. It only hides it until someone dares to look. His pulse quickened as he turned another page. I saw the light flicker. Just once. Enough to know it was no accident. The entries dated back to weeks before the storm, filled with fragmented thoughts, uneasy observations. Mentions of a visitor who came in secret. Of voices heard at night. Of Thomas speaking in hushed tones with someone at the cliffs. Daniel sat back in his chair, the journal trembling slightly in his hands. Had Agatha known something all along? Across the field, in the silhouette of the Rowley house, a figure stood still by the upper window, watching. The next morning, fog hung low over Whitley Edge, thick as milk. Daniel stood by the sea wall, journal pressed tightly under his arm. His mind churned faster than the tide. He couldn't decide whether to confront Agatha or continue reading in secret. If she'd hidden the journal, surely she hadn't meant for it to be found. And yet, she had left it in that cottage. A place she knew was once a refuge for stormwatchers. A place she once visited herself. He didn't go to her house. Not yet. Instead, Daniel walked the perimeter of the old lighthouse, this time with a torch and a crowbar in his rucksack. The chains were brittle. With a single strike, one of them gave way. The door groaned open, heavy with rust and memory. Inside, the air was sharp with salt and old oil. Mold bloomed along the base of the spiral staircase. Dust motes danced in the grey light pouring through cracks in the walls. Each step upward echoed like a drumbeat in his chest. The lantern room above, once the beacon of safety, was cloaked in silence. Its glass panes were weather-streaked and fractured. Daniel walked slowly to the edge of the room and saw it, etched faintly into the metal window frame. the 6th of October. I know. Thomas Rowley's initials. The date of his disappearance. He ran his finger along the inscription, then noticed something else, more scratches along the lower wall. Almost like marks made in a struggle. A rusty patch near the railing. The metal twisted oddly, as though something had once struck it hard. A chill crept up his spine. He returned to the journal that night, firelight flickering across the pages. Agatha had written of her dreams, unsettling ones where the sea spoke in her husband's voice. And of a man she only referred to as the second light. He came when Thomas was tired. Wore respect like a borrowed coat, but it never fit. Who was this second lightkeeper? No record had ever mentioned a replacement on the night Thomas vanished. Suddenly, the knock came. Daniel froze. It was nearly midnight. He opened the door slowly. Agatha stood there, shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, expression unreadable. I see you've found it, she said quietly, eyes on the journal in his hand. Daniel stepped back, unsure whether to apologize or explain. But Agatha didn't wait. She entered the cottage like a woman stepping back into battle. That book should have stayed buried, she said. Because what you don't yet know, is what it cost to write it. Her voice dropped to a whisper. And who else still wants it never read? The storm broke just after midnight. Wind tore through the village, rattling shutters and howling through chimneys. Inside the cottage, the fire hissed and spat as Agatha closed the door behind her. She moved with quiet certainty, her hands brushing past Daniel's notes and books as though she'd walked this room 100 times before. There was another man in the lighthouse that night, she began, her eyes on the flames. Daniel nodded. The second lightkeeper. You mentioned him in the journal. She gave a bitter smile. That was no lightkeeper. That was Constable Braithwaite. Daniel blinked. A policeman. Retired. Or so he claimed. He'd come from down the coast, Bamber or Sea Houses, I forget which he said. Moved into the village that summer. Said he'd taken the post up here to help watch the shoreline during the storms. But it was never about safety. Agatha's hands tightened around the edge of the mantelpiece. He took an interest in Thomas. Asked too many questions. Turned up at odd hours. Sometimes I'd wake and hear them speaking in low voices outside the back door. Thomas grew quiet, distracted. One night, he told me to leave the house, go stay with my sister for a few days. I refused. He insisted. That was 2 nights before the storm. She paused. Rain tapped urgently against the windows, like fingers desperate to be let in. Daniel leaned forward. You think this Braithwaite had something on him? I think he wanted something from him. And when he didn't get it, he took something else instead. She pulled a small photograph from her coat and handed it to Daniel. It was creased and faded, but clear enough. Thomas Rowley standing by the lighthouse, one hand resting on the shoulder of another man. The second man wore a long coat and a police badge, dulled with age. That was taken 2 weeks before Thomas disappeared, Agatha said. I found it in his drawer the day after he vanished. I never told the police. They wouldn't have listened. Daniel studied the image. Something about the man's expression sent a prickle down his spine. There was no friendliness in that pose. Only pressure. What happened to him? Braithwaite. Agatha looked away. He vanished. 3 days after Thomas. Left no trace. Some said he drowned, others claimed he'd never existed. The village moved on. The sea takes what it takes, they said. But I know better. She turned to Daniel, her voice fierce now. If you're going to dig up ghosts, Mr. Mercer, be sure you're ready to meet them. And then, without waiting for a reply, she slipped out into the storm. Daniel stood frozen for a long moment, the photo still in his hand. Then he turned to the journal once more. A loose page had fallen free. It bore only one line, written in trembling ink. The badge was never his. The lies were. And somewhere outside, beyond the fields and dunes, the old foghorn groaned, a sound that hadn't echoed in Whitley Edge for over a decade. Morning broke, thin and pale after the storm, leaving the coastline strewn with seaweed and shattered branches. Daniel barely slept. Agatha's words clung to him like damp wool, her warnings coiling through his thoughts with unsettling clarity. He studied the photograph again. The man beside Thomas wore a uniform, yes, but not quite right. The buttons were wrong. The cap tilted oddly. The badge was dulled beyond regulation. Everything about him was almost convincing. But not quite. He packed a torch, the journal, and a flask of coffee into his satchel and made for the lighthouse once more. The air was sharp with brine, and gulls screamed above like they knew something the living did not. The door creaked open again with effort. Inside, it smelled of wet stone and rust. Daniel climbed the winding stairs slowly, boots echoing on the metal steps. He paused at the old signal room, just below the lantern level. It had once held radios, codebooks, and a small desk where lightkeepers took turns watching the horizon. Now, it was abandoned. The desk had collapsed. The shelves were bare. Or so it seemed. Behind the desk, half concealed by a broken panel, Daniel noticed a tin box wedged into the wall cavity. He prized it loose. Inside were yellowed sheets, all handwritten. Logs. But not official ones. Private notes. By Thomas Rowley. The first page read, "If anything happens to me, someone must know the truth. He's not who he says he is. He watches me even when he pretends not to. And last night, I saw him signal something to the sea." Daniel turned the page, heart racing. He wears a badge, but the number is scratched out. There's no record of his transfer. I wrote to the office in Sea Houses. They never heard of him. Another page bore a crude map of the cliffs behind the lighthouse, marked with a large cross. Beneath it, he buried something there. Watched him dig it after dark. Too afraid to ask, Daniel folded the pages and slid them into his satchel. He had to find that spot. As he turned to leave, a sound broke the silence, a low, drawn-out breath. He froze. Another breath. Then, a whisper. So faint he nearly doubted it. But it came again. Don't trust him. Daniel spun, torch beam slicing through the dust. No one. The room was empty. But on the far wall, someone had drawn a crude symbol in charcoal, a lantern, half extinguished. He ran from the lighthouse, the journal clutched tightly in his hand. He didn't see the figure watching from the cliffside path, or the fresh set of muddy footprints leading from the signal room. Daniel returned to the cottage just as the light began to fail. The sea had receded, leaving the rocks slick and black. Every gust of wind seemed to carry a whisper now, half memory, half warning. He laid Thomas's secret pages across the table, weighed them down with a mug and his torch. The crude map drew his eye again, across above the cliffs, not far from the lighthouse. Heather-covered ground. Something buried. Whatever Braithwaite, if that had even been his real name, had hidden, Thomas had seen it. And now Daniel needed to see it too. He waited until the village had gone to sleep. No cars. No dogs barking. Just the steady push and pull of the tide. Torch in hand, he climbed the footpath that wound behind the lighthouse, boots crunching on gravel and damp earth. The wind tugged at him, but he pressed on, eyes scanning the heather for the broken circle Thomas had drawn beside the X. There, between two gnarled hawthorn bushes, the ground dipped slightly. Daniel dropped to his knees, brushed away leaves, and found the soil looser than the rest. He dug. Not far down, the torch beam caught metal. A box. Larger than the one in the signal room. He prized it out and sat back on his heels. Inside was a sealed envelope, a tarnished badge, just like the one in the photo, and something else. A revolver. Wrapped in oilcloth, rusted but recognizable. Still loaded. Daniel didn't touch it. He opened the envelope instead. Inside were clippings, small, carefully folded pieces of newspaper. Obituaries. Police reports. Missing persons. Each one bore a name and a photograph. Different men. All linked to coastal towns. All former lighthouse keepers or volunteers. And all had vanished without explanation between 1975 and 1989. A note slipped between the pages. He isn't just one man. He becomes what he needs to be. Then he disappears. The sea never keeps his secrets for long. Daniel stared at the words, stunned. This wasn't a single disappearance. It was part of something larger. Older. A movement in the bushes made him jump. He turned, torch beam slicing the night. Agatha. She stood just beyond the light, wrapped in her thick shawl, her face grim. I told you not to dig up ghosts, she said. You knew, Daniel breathed. All this time. Agatha stepped forward slowly. I knew enough. Enough to stay alive. And quiet. Why show me now? She looked past him, towards the dark line of the horizon. Because I saw him last night. Walking the edge of the cliffs. And he hasn't aged a day. Daniel felt a cold sweat bloom along his spine. You mean Braithwaite? Agatha's voice dropped. That's just one of his names. Behind them, from the direction of the lighthouse, a single lantern light flickered once, then vanished. By morning, the sky was iron grey, pressing low over Whitley Edge. Daniel hadn't slept. He and Agatha had returned to the cottage after burying the box again, exactly as it had been, neither of them willing to risk what might follow if it were moved. The clippings haunted him, So many faces. So many places. All forgotten by official records, but somehow connected by one constant, a man who never truly had a name. Agatha sat by the fire, nursing a mug of tea gone cold. He was in the village shop this morning, she said. Mrs. Haddon didn't recognize him. But I did. Same eyes. Same smile. Buying a packet of oatcakes and a tin of mackerel, as if he hadn't vanished 12 years ago. Daniel clenched his jaw. What does he want now? Agatha shook her head. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. He always returned to places where he'd left loose ends. And now, he knows someone's watching again. Daniel flipped through Thomas's journal once more. Then he paused. A final, dog-eared page, half torn, pressed against the inside cover. He carefully unfolded it. Ask for the ledger. The real one. Not at the station, but the crypt room in Morley Quay. Below the tide line. Daniel stared at the words. Do you know it? He asked. Agatha looked up slowly. Morley Quay's a day's walk south. Old naval outpost. Abandoned since the late 50s. There's a stone vault built beneath the harbour. Only opens when the tide's out. And you think that's where? Whatever he didn't want found, that's where it'll be. Later that afternoon, they drove to Morley Quay. The path to the ruins was overgrown, sea thistles brushing against Daniel's legs as they descended the rocky slope. Agatha led the way with surprising certainty. The harbour ruins were bleak. An iron ladder led down into the tide cave. Water still pooled along the bottom, but the stone door Thomas had mentioned stood slightly ajar, salt crusted around its hinges. They entered. Inside, it was dark, damp, and silent. The smell of brine and mildew clung to the walls. On a long stone table sat a weathered ledger, bound in leather, locked with a rusted clasp. Agatha ran her fingers over the cover. He was keeping records, she whispered. Of who he watched. Who he followed. Daniel prized the clasp with a blade. The book creaked open. Page after page. Names. Dates. Locations. Notes. F. Carstairs failed to comply. Resolved. L. Evans questioned authority. Removed. But then. T. Rowley intervention required. Suspect's identity. Monitoring ceased. And at the bottom of the final page. D. Mercer arrival anticipated. Shadow initiated. Daniel staggered back. He knew I was coming. Agatha's face had gone white. He's already begun. From outside the crypt room, the sound of footsteps echoed across wet stone. And a voice, smooth, steady, and far too calm. Found what you were looking for, then? Daniel turned, the ledger clutched in his hand, its pages suddenly heavy with more than just ink. The voice echoed again, closer this time, almost amused. You're not the first to go looking, Mr. Mercer. But you might just be the last. Agatha stepped in front of him, her face like flint. I knew you'd crawl back. From the shadows of the vault's arched entrance, he emerged, unchanged, as though time had circled around him instead of passing through him. His coat was dry despite the damp. His boots didn't leave footprints on the stone. And the badge glinted faintly at his chest, though no force in England would claim it now. Daniel spoke, forcing his voice to hold steady. What are you? The man smiled, head tilting slightly. I am whatever you think I am. A keeper. A watcher. A servant to the tide. Some stories are not meant to be written, Mr. Mercer. They are meant to be kept, quiet. Agatha's hand brushed Daniel's sleeve, and she whispered, we don't run. Not now. The man stepped forward. Thomas Rowley should have understood that. But he didn't. So I extinguished the light. He raised his hand slowly, revealing something clenched within it, a matchbox. Old. Wooden. Familiar. It was the same matchbox Daniel had seen in the photograph of Thomas, an object passed between hands like a secret. The symbol burned into its lid was unmistakable, the half-extinguished lantern. This, the man said softly, was his last light. He struck a match. But before the flame could catch, Agatha moved. From her coat, she drew the revolver, the same one Daniel had found beneath the heather. Its rusted barrel trembled in her grip. "It's not the gun that matters," she said coldly. "It's the truth behind it." The man looked amused. "You won't shoot me." But he flinched, just slightly. She didn't pull the trigger. Instead, she threw the ledger at his feet. "That's your legacy now," she said. "Pages and names. All of them silent. But they're not going to stay that way." Daniel lit his torch again, holding it high. "We're not afraid of your stories anymore." The man's smile faded. Somewhere above, the tide crashed higher against the quay. The stone vault groaned with pressure, its walls trembling faintly. Cracks began to stretch across the ceiling. Agatha turned to Daniel. "We have to go. Now." They ran. Up the iron ladder, into the failing light of evening. Behind them, the vault rumbled, then collapsed with a roar that shook the quay to its bones, swallowing the man, the match, and the ledger beneath 100 years of secrets. They didn't look back. That night, the lighthouse at Whitley Edge blinked to life for the first time in over a decade. A single light, burning steady against the sea. And at its window, a woman stood watching, no longer waiting, but guarding. Agatha Rowley.